The chime from my doorbell was the only sound that had disturbed the quiet of my afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I swung open the heavy steel door of my loft, it took my mind a full second to catch up with my eyes. Standing on my doorstep, looking like a pair of expensive leather shoes left out in the rain for a decade, were my daughter Jessica and her husband Mark. It had been 12 years. They looked exhausted. Mark's usually crisp polo shirt was wrinkled, and the dark circles under my daughter's eyes told a story of 1,000 sleepless nights. Their gazes swept right past me, into the 2-story open space behind me, taking in the polished concrete, the wall of windows, the art I'd collected. I saw the flicker of emotions on their faces, shock, confusion, and then a raw, undeniable envy. Mark, ever the one to need the upper hand, was the first to speak. He forced a smirk, trying to cloak his desperation in his old, familiar arrogance. He let out a dry little chuckle. "Wow," he said, his eyes doing a final, condescending sweep of my home. "Guess you sold a lot of those little quilts, huh?" He said it like an insult, a little jab to remind me of my place, the folksy, irrelevant mother with the silly, time-wasting hobby. He had no idea he was standing in the house that hobby built. He had no idea that with that one snide comment, he'd just handed me the very needle I was about to use to unravel his entire world. But that explosion was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. To understand why those were the last words he should have ever said to me, you have to understand how we got there. That pattern of disrespect had been the only thing they'd sent my way for over a decade, each thread a different shade of cruelty. And now, here they were, standing on the welcome mat of a life they never knew I had. I stepped back from the door, a silent invitation. "Come in," I said. My voice was even, calm. It didn't betray the symphony of emotions playing out inside me. They entered slowly, like explorers setting foot on a new planet. My old apartment, the one they hadn't visited in 12 years, could have fit into my new living room 4 times over. It had been a cramped, stuffy place on the 3rd floor of a walk-up, always smelling faintly of burnt sugar and fabric softener. This place was the opposite of that. It was all air and light and space. The ceiling soared 20 feet high, held up by the original timber beams from the 1920 seconds when this building was a textile mill. The afternoon sun streamed through a wall of glass that overlooked the city skyline. Mark, of course, tried to regain his footing by assessing everything. His eyes darted from the Sonos speakers embedded in the wall to the smart thermostat glowing softly near the entryway. He was quantifying my life, trying to fit it into a spreadsheet in his head where he was still the one on top. I could almost hear him calculating the square footage, estimating the property taxes. It was his way of trying to cut my success down to a size he could understand. Jessica was different. She wasn't calculating, she was consuming. Her hand drifted out to touch the rough surface of the exposed brick wall, then the cool, smooth steel of the kitchen island. She was absorbing the texture of my success. This was the life she'd always wanted, the kind she posted about on Instagram, filled with casual elegance and expensive minimalist furniture. And here it was. But it was mine. The bitter pill of that reality was written all over her face. I watched them from the kitchen, letting them wander, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. For years, their silence had been a weapon used against me. Unanswered phone calls, unreturned texts, the vast, echoing silence of holidays spent alone. Now, the silence was mine. It filled the cavernous space of my home, and it was a comfortable, powerful thing. They were the ones who had to fill it, who had to explain their presence after a 12-year absence. They finally came to a stop in the middle of the room, looking small and out of place, like a pair of garage sale armchairs in a modern art gallery. I thought back to the last time I'd seen them in person. It was at a disastrous Thanksgiving dinner at their house, a sprawling new build in a soulless suburban development. Mark had spent the entire time on his phone, talking about venture capital and seed rounds, while I had tried to make conversation with Jessica, who answered in monosyllables, her eyes constantly flicking to her husband for approval. I'd brought a handmade quilt as a gift for my grandson, one I'd spent over 100 hours on, a complex pattern of stars and planets. I saw it a few months later in a photo from Jessica's charity clothing drive, piled in a donation bin. I walked over to the built-in Miele coffee maker, another one of the toys Mark was probably appraising. The quiet hum of the machine was a world away from the sound I associated with comfort, the rhythmic, steady chugging of my old Bernina sewing machine. That machine had been my partner through everything. It stitched the prom dress Jessica couldn't afford, the baby clothes for the grandchildren I was never allowed to meet, and eventually, the patterns that built this very life. They saw it as a relic, a symbol of the simple, embarrassing mother they wanted to forget. They had no idea it was the engine of my liberation. "Can I get you some water?" I asked. The question was simple, a basic act of hospitality, but in this context it felt different. It was a reminder that I was the host, they were the guests. They were here on my terms. Jessica just nodded, unable to speak. Mark cleared his throat. "Yeah, sure, thanks." I pulled 2 heavy European-style glasses from a drawer, the kind that feels substantial in your hand, and filled them with filtered water from the dispenser in the fridge. They probably thought this was all some lucky break, a dead relative, a lottery ticket. Their minds weren't equipped to imagine a world where I, the quiet woman they had discarded, could have achieved this on my own. Their underestimation of me had always been their greatest weakness, and my greatest strength. I placed the glasses on the quartz countertop. The small clink was the only sound. I didn't smile. I just watched them. I watched them and remembered every single slight, every casual cruelty, every missed birthday. I had been tracking Mark's company online for the better part of a year, watching its stock price dwindle from a soaring eagle to a wounded pigeon. I'd read the press releases about their failed funding rounds. I knew why they were here. This wasn't a surprise visit. It was a business transaction, and I was ready. The power in the room had shifted so completely, so seismically, that the air itself felt different. They were drowning, and they had come to me expecting a life raft, not realizing I was the goddamn ocean. They were adrift in that vast, silent ocean of my living room, and the simple glasses of water I offered felt like the last rations on a sinking ship. Jessica took hers with a trembling hand, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid to look at me directly. Mark, however, took his glass and set it down on the counter with a thud that was just a little too loud. It was an act of defiance, a small, petty attempt to reclaim territory in a land that was no longer his. He leaned against the counter, trying to look casual, trying to pretend he was a guest at a party and not a beggar at the gates. He was fishing, trying to find a hook, anything to pull me back down to the person he remembered. He couldn't attack my home, it was clearly worth more than he'd ever had. He couldn't attack my appearance. I was no longer the tired, careworn woman in a faded apron. So he did what all insecure men do. He attacked my past. He attacked my passion. "So," he began, forcing a casual tone that didn't fit the desperation clinging to him like cheap cologne. He gestured vaguely around the loft with his chin. "Now that you're living like this, did you finally give that up? Your little hobby?" He said the word hobby like it was something sticky he was trying to scrape off the bottom of his shoe. "I always told Jessica you needed to get out of the house more. Something real." There it was. The insult was so familiar, so worn down from overuse, it should have been smooth. But it wasn't. It was a shard of glass he'd been carrying around for years, and he'd just tried to press it into my skin one more time. The whole glittering, sun-drenched room seemed to shrink down to the smug look on his face. And in that quiet moment, the hum of the city outside faded, and I was flooded with the sound of another machine, in another time. The steady, comforting whir of my Bernina. Suddenly, I wasn't in my loft anymore. I was back in our cramped apartment 20 years ago. The air smelled of tomato sauce and the cheap vanilla candles I used to burn. Jessica was 17, and it was prom season. All her friends were getting dresses from the fancy boutiques downtown, the ones with champagne for the mothers and price tags that looked like mortgage payments. We couldn't afford that. We couldn't even afford the knockoffs at the department store. I told her we'd find something beautiful at a thrift store, that we could make it our own. I was trying to put a brave face on it, but I saw the quiet heartbreak in her eyes. A few days later, she left a magazine open on the kitchen table. It was a page from Vogue, a whisper-thin model in a silk charmeuse gown, the color of a twilight sky. It was elegant, simple, and catastrophically expensive. Jessica didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She just left it there as a testament to a dream she knew was impossible. That night, after she went to bed, I studied that photograph for 3 hours. I sketched the seams, the drape of the bias-cut fabric, the way the neckline fell. The next day, I took a bus to the garment district and spent hours walking through dusty, crowded shops until I found a bolt of silk that was almost the exact same color. It cost more than our grocery budget for 2 weeks, but I bought it. For the next 10 nights, after working my 8-hour shift at the diner, I lived at that sewing machine. The apartment would be dark and quiet, and the only light would be the small one on my Bernina, illuminating my work. I drank bitter, instant coffee to stay awake, the needle becoming an extension of my own fingers. I remember the cool, slippery feel of the silk, the frustration of a crooked seam I had to unpick, the small victories as the pieces came together. I wasn't just sewing a dress. I was stitching my love for my daughter into physical form. I was trying to prove to her, and maybe to myself, that a life without a lot of money didn't have to be a life without beauty. On the night before her prom, I hung it on her bedroom door. When she saw it, she didn't speak. She just touched the fabric, her eyes tracing the seams that I knew by heart. Then she looked at me, her face shining with a kind of awe that I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. "Mom," she whispered, wrapping her arms around my neck. "It's perfect. It's better than the one in the magazine." She pulled back and held my hands, her gaze falling on my fingertips, which were pricked and raw. "You can make anything. You can make anything." Her words echoed in the silence of my loft, a ghostly sound from a life I no longer lived. I looked at the woman standing before me now, this stranger with my daughter's face. The girl who believed I could create magic had been replaced by a woman who stood silently by while her husband called that same magic a little hobby. I drew my finger along the perfect, laser-cut seam of the quartz island, a long, silent line. Mark was still looking at me, expecting a reaction. He wanted me to get flustered, to defend myself, to shrink back into the woman he thought he knew. He was waiting for the person who would have apologized for her own passion. But she didn't live here anymore. No, that woman didn't live here anymore. The person he was speaking to, the one he thought he could poke and prod, was a ghost. She had died a slow death over 12 years, and his words were just an insult scrawled on a tombstone he didn't even know he was standing on. His jab about my little hobby wasn't a single attack. It was the echo of 1,000 other cuts, each one delivered with the same casual, dismissive cruelty. As I stood there, silent, the memories began to play back, not as a flood, but as a series of sharp, distinct snapshots of a long and carefully managed execution. The first cut was the christening. My grandson, Michael, their firstborn. I wasn't there. I remember the phone call from Jessica like it was yesterday. Her voice was high and tight, the way it got when Mark was in the room with her, coaching her from just out of frame. "Mom, so, about the christening, it's going to be a really small thing," she'd said, the lie already flimsy. I could hear the clink of ice in a glass in the background. Mark's 5 o'clock bourbon. "It's at the club, and, well, all of Mark's investor friends will be there, you know how it is." I didn't know how it was. I knew I had spent the previous week working on a beautiful hand-smocked christening gown, using the same pattern my own mother had used for me. It was sitting in a box, wrapped in tissue paper, on my dining room table as she spoke, an heirloom for a family that had no interest in its own history. "Oh, of course, sweetie," I'd said, my voice sounding impossibly cheerful. "You guys have fun. Give the baby a kiss for me." The silence after she hung up was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I saw the pictures later on Facebook. It wasn't a small thing. There were over 100 people, champagne fountains, the whole 9 yards. I wasn't family. I was a liability to their brand. The second cut was in public, of all places, a Costco on a Saturday. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the air smelled of hot dogs and bulk packaged cinnamon, and the sheer volume of people and product was overwhelming. Mark was pushing one of those giant flatbed carts, piling it high with imported cheeses and cases of boutique beer, while I trailed behind, feeling like a visitor from another century. One of his friends, another guy in a crisp pastel polo shirt, clapped him on the back. They started talking, and I became invisible. "Yeah, my mother-in-law," Mark had said, loud enough for half the store to hear, gesturing vaguely in my direction without actually looking at me. "She's sweet, but she's stuck in the 1,950 seconds. All she does is sew," his friend chuckled. "Seriously," Mark continued, picking up a giant wheel of brie. "I keep telling Jess she needs to get her mom into yoga or something. These analog hobbies are a waste of human capital. A waste of human capital." He said it with such authority, as if he were a Wall Street analyst discussing a failing stock. He reduced my life's passion, the skill that had clothed my daughter and brought me joy, to a line item on a balance sheet and found it wanting. I remember just staring at a pallet of Kirkland paper towels, my face burning with a shame that wasn't even mine. I felt 2 inches tall. But the deepest cut, the one that severed the final thread of hope I had, was about a quilt. For Michael's 5th birthday, I decided to make him a masterpiece. I spent 6 months on it. It was a map of the solar system, each planet intricately pieced and appliqued. Mars had tiny embroidered craters. Saturn's rings were made of shimmering silver thread. Jupiter's great red spot was a swirling vortex of a dozen different shades of silk. It was the most complex thing I had ever made. I poured everything into it, my love for the grandson I barely knew, my hopes for a connection, my art. I gave it to him at his party, one of the last I was invited to. He loved it, for about 10 minutes. Then Mark whisked it away, saying it was too nice for a kid's room and that they'd put it away for safekeeping. 6 months later, one of my friends from my old neighborhood sent me a link. Jessica had chaired a big charity clothing drive at her club. There were pictures online, and in the background of one photo, in a large cardboard bin marked linens and blankets, I saw it. Tucked between a stained comforter and a faded beach towel, I could just make out the unmistakable swirl of Jupiter's great red spot. They hadn't even stored it. They had donated it, like it was trash. 600 hours of my life, of my love, tossed into a bin without a second thought. That Christmas, they sent me a mug in the mail. It arrived a week late. It was a cheap, lightweight ceramic thing with "World's Best Grandma" printed on it in a clunky, generic font. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was a re-gift from Mark's office Secret Santa. The contrast was so grotesque, so insulting, it almost felt like a joke. They had traded my masterpiece for a mug. That was the moment I understood. It was never one thing, it was everything. It was a deliberate campaign to keep me at arm's length, to slowly and systematically erase the parts of their life that didn't fit the glossy, upwardly mobile picture they were selling. I wasn't a person to them. I was an inconvenient truth. I was the living, breathing reminder of a past they were desperate to outrun. So, as I stood there in my beautiful, sun-filled loft, listening to the echo of his insult, I wasn't hurt. The time for hurt was long past. All I felt was a cold, clear, and quiet calm. The calm of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for an apology and had decided instead to write the final chapter herself. That calm was the ink in my pen, and it was time to write the final chapter. I finally pulled my eyes away from Mark's face, leaving his insult to hang in the air between us, unanswered. I turned my back on them both, a simple act that felt monumental. For 12 years, my life had been oriented around them, waiting for a call, hoping for an invitation, arranging my emotions to make them more comfortable. Turning my back was a revolution. I started walking toward the far end of the loft, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished concrete. The silence I left behind was heavy, thick with their confusion. I could feel their eyes on my back. I knew what they were thinking. They were probably expecting me to break down, to go to a bedroom and cry, to play the part of the wounded mother they had cast me as for years. But I just kept walking, my pace deliberate and even. Each step was a punctuation mark in a sentence I had been composing for a very long time. The journey across the vast open space felt like crossing a stage. On one side was my past, the hurt, the dismissal, the loneliness. On the other was the future I had built in secret, a future that was hiding in plain sight. My destination was a large, imposing door. It was nothing like the flimsy, hollow core doors of my old apartment. This one was solid, made of steel and frosted glass that distorted the light from within, hinting at a world of activity but revealing nothing. It was a door that promised privacy and purpose. Beside the sleek, minimalist handle was a small, dark square of glass, flush with the wall. I stopped in front of it, close enough to feel the cool air radiating from its surface. I didn't turn around, but I could hear the rustle of their clothes as they shifted their weight, their impatience growing. The elephant in the room, the real reason for their visit, was still waiting in the wings, but I was the director of this play now, and I would decide when each actor made their entrance. I knew they were waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge their presence, to make it easy for them. I refused. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch until it was taut and humming, like a high-voltage wire. Finally, Jessica's voice, small and strained, broke the stillness. "Mom, what's in there?" Her question was a child's question, full of a simple curiosity that was jarringly out of place. She probably imagined a lavish master bedroom or maybe a home gym. A walk-in closet the size of my old kitchen. Another luxury to add to the mental inventory she was taking. Mark was likely thinking something more cynical. A meditation room. Some silly, expensive indulgence for a lonely woman with more money than sense. The possibilities in their minds were all extensions of the person they thought I was. I rested my hand on the cool glass of the door, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a faint reflection of the woman standing behind me. A stranger. I thought about the irony of it all. They had spent more than a decade closing doors on me, shutting me out of their lives, their homes, their celebrations. Each time they had done it with a quiet, polite finality that was more brutal than any slammed door. Now, here we all were, standing before a door of my own, and for the first time, I was the one holding the key. I turned my head slightly, just enough to speak over my shoulder. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the vast, open space. My office. 2 words, that's all it took. I heard Jessica draw in a sharp little breath. The word hung in the air, completely at odds with every idea they'd ever had about me. An office. It was a word of business, of purpose, of a life that extended beyond the 4 walls of a home. It was not a word they had ever associated with their mother, the woman with the little hobby. I saw Mark's reflection in the glass, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He still didn't get it. He probably thought I called my sewing room an office to sound important. The condescension was a part of him, as natural as breathing. He had no capacity to imagine that my world could be as complex or as serious as his own. He, the failed tech genius, was about to be confronted with a truth his ego could not possibly process. I turned back to the door and placed my thumb on the small glass square. There was a soft electronic chime, and a thin line of green light glowed around the panel. It was a biometric scanner. The lock clicked open with a satisfying, definitive sound, the sound of access being granted, the sound of a world opening up. I let my hand fall to my side, but I didn't open the door just yet. I wanted them to absorb this one, final detail. The lock on this door was more sophisticated than the one on his failed startup server room. I was going to let them see everything. They had judged my life's work without ever truly seeing it. Now they would. The slow burn was over. The sudden reveal was about to begin. The click of the lock opening was a definitive, final sound, an announcement that the world was about to change. My hand was on the cold steel handle, and all I had to do was pull. The slow burn was over. The sudden reveal was about to begin. I paused, just for a beat, savoring the last second of their ignorance. It was a moment of perfect, crystalline quiet before the avalanche. And in that quiet, Jessica broke. The tension was too much. The strangeness of the room, my unnerving calm, the heavy, unspoken reason for their visit at all, came crashing down on her at once. "Mom, please." Her voice was a ragged whisper, thin and sharp in the cavernous room. It was the first time she had sounded like my daughter in 12 years. Not the polished, aloof suburban wife, but the scared girl who used to run to me when she had a nightmare. I turned my head slowly, away from the door, and looked at her. Her carefully constructed composure had shattered into a million pieces. Tears were streaming down her face, leaving clean tracks through her expensive foundation. Mark shot her a look of pure fury, a silent, vicious command to pull it together, but she didn't even see him. Her eyes were locked on me, wide and pleading. "We're in trouble," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a messy, desperate rush. "Real trouble. Mark's company. Cinch, AI, it's gone. It's all gone." "Oh." I remained silent, my hand still resting on the door handle. I didn't need to ask questions. I'd been following the spectacular implosion of Cinch AI for the last 18 months. I'd read the tech blogs that went from calling Mark a visionary to a cautionary tale. I'd seen the public filings when his investors pulled out, and I'd cross-referenced them with the county records for the mortgage on their house. I knew exactly how much trouble they were in, probably down to the penny. "The bottom just fell out," she continued, her voice gaining a hysterical edge. "We kept thinking he could save it, that another round of funding would come through. We were robbing Peter to pay Paul for months, using the credit cards to make payroll, taking out a second mortgage on the house. We thought we were just buying time." "Jessica, that's enough," Mark hissed, his voice a low growl. He took a step toward her, but she flinched away from him. "No, she cried, looking at him with a flash of defiance I hadn't seen in her for years. No, she needs to know. It's not enough. It's over. She turned back to me, her whole body trembling. The house is in foreclosure, Mom. The bank is taking it. They sent the notice last week. We have 30 days. 30 days to pack up our entire lives. The house. Of course, it came down to the house. The 5,000 square foot monstrosity with the 3-car garage and the perfectly manicured lawn that required a team of gardeners. The house where my grandson's beautiful handmade quilt was deemed unworthy. The house that was the stage for all their parties, the ones I was never invited to. The house that was the entire foundation of their sham life, the physical proof that they were better, more successful, more important than the simple woman who raised her. And now it was all turning to dust. We've lost everything, she wept. The cars are leased, they'll be repossessed. The club membership is gone. I had to sell my wedding ring last month just to keep the lights on. The kids. Oh God, the kids don't know anything except that we're fighting all the time and the pantry is half empty. I listened, my expression unreadable. I felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't the pity she was so desperately trying to evoke. It was a kind of cold, academic clarity. I was watching a hypothesis being proven in real time. The hypothesis was this, that the entire world they had built was a house of cards, and that they had sacrificed real, unconditional love for a handful of paper that was now blowing away in the wind. She wasn't crying for me. She wasn't crying for the 12 years we'd lost. She was crying for the granite countertops and the walk-in closets. She was mourning the loss of her status. She took a shaky step toward me, her hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication. We have nowhere to go. Mark's parents can't help. We have no one else to turn to. Mom, we need money. We need your help. There it was. The real reason. Not an apology. Not a reconciliation. A withdrawal slip. After 12 years of treating me like a dirty secret, I had suddenly been promoted to the role of emergency fund. Her confession finally petered out, leaving only the sound of her ragged sobs echoing in the silence. They had laid all their cards on the table, a miserable hand of debt and desperation. They had made themselves completely and utterly vulnerable, exposing the rot at the core of their perfect life. And they had done it all in front of a closed door, still believing, in their arrogance, that they were talking to the same woman they had so easily thrown away. They laid their ruin at the feet of a ghost, expecting absolution, a handout from the simple, soft-hearted woman they had so easily thrown away. I listened to the last of my daughter's sobs die out in the vast, quiet room. I took a slow, deep breath, held it for a moment, and then I pulled the door open. The light that spilled out wasn't the warm yellow glow of a cozy sewing room, it was the cool, white, focused light of a design studio. The air that flowed out wasn't filled with the scent of fabric and dust, but with the clean, sterile smell of high-end electronics and the faint, sharp tang of printer's ink. I stepped aside and gestured them in with a simple, silent nod. They hesitated for a second, then shuffled forward like sleepwalkers, crossing the threshold from the world they thought they knew into the one I had actually built. The room was a testament to everything they believed I wasn't. On the right, a bank of 4 massive, 4 Kelvin's monitors was mounted to the wall, displaying what looked like architectural blueprints complex, geometric patterns rendered in breathtaking detail, with vector lines and algorithmic curves that shifted and reformed as a program ran its course. Below them, a sleek black workstation housed 2 powerful Mac Studio computers, their minimalist design a stark contrast to the noisy, clunky towers Mark used to brag about. This wasn't a place for hobbies. This was a place where serious computational work was done. To their left, against the far wall, stood a machine the size of a small car. It was a wide format, industrial textile printer, its rollers and print heads gleaming under the track lighting. Next to it were massive bolts of raw, high-grade Belgian linen and Egyptian cotton, waiting to be fed into its maw. On the wall above it, framed like works of art, were finished fabric samples. I saw Jessica's eyes widen as she recognized one of the patterns, a complex, interlocking starburst design printed on a swatch of velvet. She'd seen it in a high-fashion magazine, featured in the collection of a famous Parisian designer. She just never knew her mother was the one who had created it. Mark, on the other hand, was frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He was staring at the shipping station that occupied the back corner of the room. It was a professional setup, with label printers, packing materials, and digital scales. On a clipboard hung a list of the day's orders. The destinations were not local: Tokyo, Japan; Berlin, Germany; Milan, Italy; Sydney, Australia. He, the man who dreamed of building a global tech company, was standing in the distribution hub of a business that had actually achieved it. His gaze fell on a stack of neatly printed boxes, all bearing a crisp, minimalist logo, a stylized needle and thread forming a perfect circle. And then, in the very center of all this cool modern technology, was the heart of it all. On a specially designed standalone pedestal, under its own dedicated spotlight, sat my old Bernina sewing machine. It was the same one I'd used to sew Jessica's prom dress, the same one I'd used to create the solar system quilt for my grandson. It was immaculate, polished to a high sheen, its familiar shape a piece of analog sculpture in a digital world. It was not a relic, it was a throne. It was the quiet, steady source from which this entire universe had sprung. It was a reminder that every complex algorithm on those screens began with a simple, perfect stitch. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the low, almost imperceptible hum of the servers in a cooled rack against the wall. They stood in the middle of the floor, dumbfounded, their own messy, desperate world of foreclosure and failure colliding with this clean, quiet, and profoundly successful reality. They had walked in here to ask a poor, lonely old woman for a handout. They had found instead a titan of industry they didn't even know existed. The sheer scale of their miscalculation was so immense, so total, that it seemed to have short-circuited their brains. After letting the silence stretch for a full minute, I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the hum of the machines like a diamond. "Welcome to my little hobby." Jessica flinched as if I'd slapped her. Mark just stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. I walked over to the main workstation and tapped a key. One of the giant monitors switched from a complex design to a clean, professional website homepage. The logo I'd designed was at the top, over a simple, powerful name. "This," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the hum of the computer, "is Precision Patchwork. It's not a hobby, it's a digital asset and design licensing company. I create and sell complex algorithmic patterns to textile manufacturers, fashion houses, and software companies around the world." I turned to face them. They were still frozen, two statues in the center of my empire. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had been annihilated. They had come to my door holding a lit match, expecting to find a timid woman they could scare. They had discovered, to their horror, that the whole house was made of stone, and they were the only flammable things in it. They were flammable, and the air in my studio was suddenly very, very dry. I turned away from the glowing screen and faced them fully for the first time. The ghost they had been speaking to was gone. The woman standing before them now was the CEO of a life they couldn't even begin to comprehend. They had come here to make a withdrawal, but I was here to make a reckoning. I leaned back against the cool metal of the workstation, crossing my arms. My voice, when I spoke, was not the voice of their mother. It was the voice of a creditor, here to list, in detail, the full extent of their debt. "You came here to ask for money," I began, my tone flat and matter-of-fact. "So before we talk about my finances, let's talk about yours. Not the dollars and cents, I already know all about that. Let's talk about your emotional and moral bankruptcy. Let's do an audit of the last 12 years. Jessica physically recoiled, wrapping her arms around herself. Mark's jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching violently beneath his skin. "Let's start with Michael's christening," I said, my eyes locked on my daughter. "You told me it was a small thing. You said the club was crowded. The truth is, you didn't want your new wealthy friends to meet your simple working-class mother. You were ashamed. You traded my presence at my own grandson's baptism for the approval of people you barely knew. That was your first major withdrawal from our relationship." Jessica started to sob quietly, a desperate, hiccuping sound. I ignored it. I turned my gaze to Mark. "Then there was the Costco incident," I continued, my voice dropping a little lower, a little sharper. "You stood 10 feet away from me, next to a mountain of toilet paper, and you told your friend I was stuck in the 1,950 seconds. You said my passion, the very skill that paid for the roof over my daughter's head for 18 years was, and I believe I'm quoting you correctly, a waste of human capital." I let his own ugly words hang in the air between us. "You, Mark, You, with your half-baked ideas and your borrowed money, you stood in a warehouse store and passed judgment on my life's work. You, who have never built a single tangible thing in your life, dismissed my craft as worthless. You were so busy trying to build a brand that you forgot to build any character. His face was turning a blotchy red, but he was trapped. There was nothing to say. There was no defense. It was the truth. But the real bankruptcy, I said, my gaze shifting back to Jessica, pinning her in place, the moment I knew the account was fully overdrawn, was the quilt. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified recognition. The solar system quilt. I spent 600 hours on that quilt, Jessica. I poured every bit of love I had for a grandson. I was never allowed to see into every single stitch. I gave you a masterpiece, a family heirloom, a piece of my soul, and you threw it in a donation bin. No, she whispered, shaking her head frantically. We didn't. It was a mistake. Stop, I said, my voice cutting through her lie with surgical precision. Don't you dare lie to me. Not here, not now. You threw it away because it was handmade, because it was humble, because it came from me. It didn't have a designer label, so it had no value in your world. You erased 600 hours of my love because it didn't fit your aesthetic. I pushed off the workstation and took a slow step toward them. That Christmas you sent me a mug, a cheap re-gifted mug from an office party. That's what you decided I was worth. That's the value you placed on our entire relationship, a masterpiece for a mug. Tell me, Jessica, from a purely financial perspective, does that sound like a good investment to you? She crumpled, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. I looked back at Mark. For 12 years, the two of you worked very, very hard to edit me out of your lives. You treated me like a rough draft, a first chapter you were embarrassed by. You weren't just pushing me away. You were pushing away my work, my skills, my identity. You saw this, I said, gesturing around the gleaming studio, as a silly, embarrassing hobby for a lonely old woman. And the great irony, the absolute punchline to this whole pathetic joke, is that the thing you were so ashamed of is what paid for all of this. I let that sink in, the final crushing weight of it. This waste of human capital is a multi-million-dollar international business. This little hobby is more successful, more profitable, and more respected than your sad failed startup ever was. I didn't get lucky. I didn't win the lottery. I worked. I built this, stitch by stitch, algorithm by algorithm, while you were busy playing make-believe in the suburbs. I stopped directly in front of them. So, no, I said, my voice now dropping to a quiet final whisper. I will not be giving you any money. My help is not on the table. You see, you taught me a valuable lesson about business, Mark. You taught me not to invest in people who have proven, time and time again, to be a bad bet. You taught me not to invest in people who have proven, time and time again, to be a bad bet. My words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Jessica was a lost cause, a weeping mess of regret on the cold concrete floor. But Mark had one last fight in him. The shock that had held him paralyzed for the last 10 minutes finally cracked, and what emerged was a raw, ugly, predictable rage. A bad bet? He sputtered, his voice cracking with disbelief. He took a menacing step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. You stand here in your glorified craft room with your lucky break, and you dare to lecture me about business. You have no idea what it takes. The pressure, the strategy, the vision. You've been playing with thread in a corner your whole life. I was building the future. His voice rose with every word, a desperate, screeching crescendo. It was a pathetic performance, the last roar of a dying animal. He was trying to conjure the old dynamic, to swell up and make me feel small again. But the room was too big now, and he had never seemed so tiny. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just watched him, my expression unchanging, letting him exhaust himself. My internal monologue was quiet. I wasn't angry. I was watching a man mourn the death of his own delusion, and it was a profoundly pitiful sight. He had built his entire identity on the idea of being a visionary, a titan, the smartest guy in every room. The truth that he was a failure who had been eclipsed by the mother-in-law he held in contempt was a reality his ego was simply not equipped to survive. "You got lucky," he finally shouted, his face a blotchy, furious red. Some forgotten relative died, some lottery ticket paid out. Don't you dare pretend this is something you earned. This isn't success, it's a fluke. I let his accusation hang in the air, letting the sheer stupidity of it settle. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he couldn't even see the truth when it was laid out before him on a dozen glowing monitors. He needed to believe I was lucky, because the alternative that I was smarter, more talented, and more successful than him was simply unbearable. I let him stand there, panting, his rage finally sputtering out into a tense, vibrating silence. Then, I tilted my head slightly. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice still quiet, still calm. He just glared at me, his chest heaving. "Good," I said. "Then let me ask you a question about the future you were building. Your last funding round for Cinch AI, the big one, the Series B that was supposed to save everything. Who did you pitch to?" The question threw him. It was so specific, so out of left field. "What?" "The name of the venture capital firm," I pressed, my voice patient, like a teacher coaxing an answer from a slow student. "The one that turned you down last month. The one that finally put the nail in your company's coffin. What was their name?" He looked utterly bewildered, but he answered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "The Atherton Group." "Why?" A slow, genuine smile spread across my face for the first time. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated, cosmic irony. "The Atherton Group," I repeated, savoring the name. "Yes, they're a very smart private equity firm, very discerning. They specialize in finding undervalued legacy sectors and modernizing them for the digital age. They're brilliant. They're also a wholly owned subsidiary of the Rochdale Textile Conglomerate." I paused, letting him connect the dots. I saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes, the dawning, sickening wave of comprehension that was about to hit him. "Rochdale," I continued, my voice as soft as silk, "is my newest client. 3 months ago, I signed an 8-figure licensing deal giving them exclusive international rights to the core pattern generation algorithm that runs this entire business. It was the largest deal in their company's history. They're building their entire next-generation digital fabric division around my work." I let the weight of that sink in. I saw Jessica look up from the floor, her tear-streaked face a mask of utter disbelief. "The managing partner at Atherton, a lovely man named David Chen, mentioned your company to me last week," I said, my tone now light and conversational. "He said a plucky little AI startup had come to them, desperate for cash. He said they passed, of course, but he'd looked over your pitch deck. He did it as a courtesy. A courtesy to me, their new very valuable partner." Mark made a small strangled sound in the back of his throat. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut, all the air and all the fight driven out of him in a single brutal instant. I walked over to my desk and picked up a tablet, swiped it on and turned it to face him. It was an email from David Chen. "In fact," I said, "I believe I have his exact words right here." I read from the screen, my voice clear and steady. "We reviewed the pitch from Cinch AI, over-leveraged derivative tech, and no clear path to profitability." And then he said this. He said, "Frankly, Carol, it was a bad investment." I set the tablet down. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a man's entire world being reduced to a single, dismissive email. It was the sound of his life's work being called worthless by the very people he idolized. And worst of all, it was the sound of him realizing that the woman he had dismissed as an irrelevant, analog fool, the woman with the silly little hobby, was the quiet, invisible force that had held the gavel at his professional execution. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. He just deflated. The anger, the arrogance, the bluster, it all evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a man staring at me with the dead, empty eyes of someone who had just understood, in a single, horrific moment, that he had lost the game before he even knew who he was playing against. He had lost the game before he even knew who he was playing against. The ringing silence that followed his collapse was absolute. All the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum where his monstrous ego used to be. He just stood there, swaying slightly, a hollowed-out man in a wrinkled polo shirt. He was a ghost now, a footnote in a story that was no longer about him. And in that vacuum, for the first time in 12 years, my daughter began to breathe on her own. Jessica slowly, painfully, pushed herself up from the floor. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on her husband, but she wasn't seeing the man she loved. She was seeing a stranger. A con artist, a saboteur, the architect of her own quiet ruin. All the color had drained from her face, leaving behind a stark, bone-white clarity. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not the sobbing, hysterical cry from before. It was a low, dead, horrified whisper. "You told me she was holding us back," she said, the words directed at Mark but spoken to the room. "That was what you said, over and over. Your mother with her old-fashioned ideas, she's an anchor, Jess. We're a rocket ship." Mark didn't respond. He didn't seem capable of it. He just stared into the middle distance, his eyes as blank as a turned-off screen. "You told me we needed to be around the right people," Jessica continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "People who understood our vision, people who could help us. And she wasn't one of them. She was embarrassing. That's the word you used after that Thanksgiving dinner. You said my own mother was embarrassing because she asked your boss about his grandchildren instead of his portfolio." She took a step away from him, a small shuffling movement that felt like a continent shifting. It was the first time I had seen her create physical distance between them. "Every time I wanted to call her," she said, her voice trembling with a new emotion, not grief, but rage. "Every time I missed her, you had a reason why it was a bad idea. It would create drama. It would send the wrong message. It would undermine our brand. Our brand, my God. I sacrificed my mother for a brand." She finally looked at me, her eyes filled with a self-loathing so profound it was almost difficult to witness. He would say these things, and I let him. I believed him, or I chose to. It was easier. It was easier to believe that you were the problem than to admit that the perfect, brilliant man I married was a cruel, insecure little boy who was terrified of anyone who might have more influence over me than he did. I remained silent, watching this confession unfold. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction. I just felt a deep, profound wave of sadness. I was watching my daughter perform a brutal, bloody surgery on her own life, cutting out the cancer that she had allowed to grow for more than a decade. I remembered the girl who used to have such a strong voice, who would argue with me about politics and art and everything under the Sunday. Mark hadn't just isolated her. He had systematically dismantled her, piece by piece, until all that was left was a beautiful, empty vessel for his own ambition. "The quilt," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I lied, it wasn't a mistake. He told me to get rid of it. He said it looked tacky and homemade, and that it didn't fit the minimalist aesthetic we were trying to cultivate. And I packed it in the donation box myself. I took this beautiful, magical thing you made for my son, and I treated it like it was worthless." She finally turned her whole body to face me, the space between her and her husband now a vast, unbridgeable chasm. She was no longer crying for her lost house or her sold jewelry. The tears that streamed down her face now were for something far more valuable. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she choked out, the words raw and torn from the deepest part of her. "It wasn't just that I left. It was that I let him poison me against you. I let him convince me that your love was a liability. I traded you. I traded you for nothing, for a pile of debt and a house of cards. I am so, so sorry." Her apology hung in the air, a fragile, desperate thing in the cool, humming quiet of my studio. It was the apology I had spent years dreaming of, the one I had played out in my mind 1,000 lonely nights. I had imagined I would feel a rush of forgiveness, that I would open my arms and welcome my lost daughter home. But I felt nothing. Not anger, not forgiveness, just a vast, quiet emptiness. The damage was too deep. The scar tissue was too thick. Her apology was the first step on a road that was 1,000 miles long, and she was only just now realizing she was at the starting line. The girl who loved the prom dress and the woman who threw away the quilt were the same person, and I didn't know how to reconcile those two realities. I just stood there, watching her, letting my silence be the answer. I let her feel the full crushing weight of the 12 years she had thrown away. Her reckoning had come, not because she had found her moral compass, but because her world had burned to the ground. And now, standing in the ashes, she was finally seeing things clearly for the first time. Standing in the ashes of her own making, my daughter was finally seeing things clearly for the first time. Her apology, raw and real as it was, hung in the sterile air of my studio. It was a bridge she was trying to build back to me, but the canyon between us had been carved over 12 long years, and it was too wide, too deep. A few desperate words were not enough to cross it. I looked at her, this broken woman with the face of the girl I had raised, and I felt a profound and weary sadness. I grieved for the daughter I had lost, the one who believed I could make anything. But that grief was an old, familiar ache, and it no longer had the power to make me act against my own self-preservation. Her reckoning was hers, not mine. I had already survived my own. I finally broke the silence, not with words but with action. I turned away from them and walked out of the studio. My footsteps were the only sound, a steady, rhythmic beat against the concrete floor. I didn't look back to see if they were following. I knew they were. The magnetic pull of their desperation was still strong, but it no longer had any hold on me. I was the North Star now, and my direction was my own. I walked back through the cavernous living room, past the art they didn't understand and the furniture they could never afford. The space that had seemed so vast and intimidating to them upon their arrival now felt like my sanctuary, my fortress. The afternoon light was beginning to soften, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like quiet, sleeping giants. They trailed behind me, their movements slow and shuffling. It was the walk of the defeated, the walk of people who have been stripped of all their illusions. Mark was a ghost, a shell of a man, his eyes vacant and fixed on the floor. Jessica was a raw, open wound, her quiet sobs the only proof she was still there at all. When we reached the heavy steel door, I turned to face them one last time. Jessica looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and smeared makeup. Her eyes were full of a desperate, pleading question. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. What do I do now? What happens now?" It was the question of a lost child, asking for a map, and for a fleeting, painful moment, the mother in me wanted to give her one. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, that we could fix this, that I could help. But that was the old me, the woman who would have set herself on fire to keep her child warm. The new me knew that some fires are not yours to tend. I looked into my daughter's eyes, and I gave her the only thing I had left to give, the hard, unvarnished truth. "Now," I said, my voice soft but unyielding, "you and your husband will face the consequences of your own choices. You will learn to live with what you have done. That is what happens now." "But us?" she pressed, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. "Is this it? After all this time? Is it just over?" I reached out, not to touch her, but to place my hand on the cool, solid surface of the door. The door she and her husband had walked through hours ago, full of arrogance and deceit. The door that was now their only exit. "Jessica," I said, and her name felt strange on my tongue after so many years of silence. "The life I have built here is quiet. It is peaceful. It has taken me 12 years of loneliness and hard work to achieve that peace." I paused, letting my words settle in the space between us. "It is the most valuable thing I own, and it is not for sale. It is not available as collateral for your bad decisions. It is not a life raft for a marriage you allowed to shipwreck. Hey!" I pulled the heavy door open, and the sounds of the city rushed in a distant siren, the rumble of traffic, the murmur of a world that had kept turning even as theirs had fallen apart. I looked at my daughter, this stranger who wore her face, and I gave her my final verdict. "I hope you find your way. I truly do. But you will have to do it without me." Mark shuffled past me without a word, his eyes still fixed on the floor, a completely broken man. Jessica hesitated at the threshold, her body racked with a final, shuddering sob. She looked at me one last time, her eyes screaming all the things her voice could not. Then, she turned and followed her husband out into the hallway. I watched them go, two small, defeated figures retreating from the light of my home, and then I closed the door. The lock engaged with a solid, satisfying thump. It was the sound of a chapter ending, the sound of a boundary being drawn in steel and stone, the sound of a life being reclaimed. The silence that filled my loft now was different. It was not the tense, waiting silence from before. It was a deep, profound, and peaceful quiet. I walked over to the wall of windows and looked out at the city skyline as the sun began to set, painting the clouds in shades of lavender and gold. The world was vast and beautiful, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like my own small part of it was completely and utterly safe.